We are in award season, and with the Oscars not too far away, I wanted to talk about what is, in my opinion, the least respected genre, and that, of course, is horror. There is no genre that the Academy is as adamantly against as this one. It seems that the chance of a horror movie winning an Oscar is the same as a snowball's chance in hell. You could also make a very compelling argument for comedies getting snubbed too, but god damn it, this video is about horror! There has always been this stigma against horror, with many viewing it as a lower art, and the countless amounts of cheap slasher movies that we have seen throughout the years have not helped in combating this reputation. But I would make the argument that there are plenty of exceptional movies that just happen to be in the horror genre that have been chaotically overlooked by critics. I'll give a few examples. The Shining. When we look back at it, many of us would agree that The Shining is one of the greatest movies ever made, and the attention to detail is impeccable. Setting aside the differences from the book, you still have to acknowledge The Shining as not just one of the best horror movies ever, but as one of the best movies ever. Yet the movie got virtually no love from the Oscars. In fact, the movie was initially viewed as a flop, before people started dissecting and appreciating the film. I view The Shining as the horror genre's equivalent to Citizen Kane, since both movies were initially dismissed until later viewers found the art. Citizen Kane didn't get its flowers until French critics examined and developed a love for the movie much later on, and I find a similar pattern to be there with The Shining. But now let's talk about a more recent snub, Hereditary. This movie was amazing, and while I understand it's not the typical Oscar contender, there is one nomination this movie absolutely deserved. Best Actress. Toni Collette completely took over the film, and she gave a mind-bogglingly great performance. She gave such a wide array of emotions, and she was yelling in a foreign accent, but she never slipped or seemed too far-fetched. It's crazy to think she's Australian because she's just that convincing. The tension and pressure she gave wrapped you into the film and made you care about what would happen to this family. Her performance was literally perfect, and I don't think anyone else could execute the part to the caliber she did. Yet there was no reception from the Oscars, not even a nomination. It's crazy because Toni Collette was nominated for another horror movie, The Sixth Sense. Although, that's not a typical horror movie, but that's not the point right now. She was nominated for a great movie. And don't get me wrong, her acting is amazing in that film, but I wouldn't say it reached the heights of her performance in Hereditary. So why are horror movies so disliked? To be completely honest, I'm not entirely sure. Maybe it's just the stigma around horror movies that stops them from being recognized, and maybe this bias toward quote-unquote high art is to blame. If I'm guessing, it has to deal with the fact that the horror movie usually involves itself with superstitions, monsters, and other things that we believe to not be true. Maybe this suspension of disbelief has proven too much for critics to bear. To understand this better, let's look at horror movies that did succeed. Psycho from Alfred Hitchcock did quite well at the Oscars, especially for a horror movie. It had a good amount of nominations, but also, it came from arguably the greatest director to ever live, so maybe Psycho is an outlier. My favorite movie of all time, and one that recently turned 33 years old, The Silence of the Lambs, is only one of 3 movies ever to win the Big Five. That is Best Picture, Best Screenplay, Best Director, Best Actress, and Best Actor. The only other 2 movies to have won this award are It Happened One Night and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. The Silence of the Lambs win is even more impressive when you factor in the genre stigma against it and how it had to conquer these to succeed. Another more modern example would be Get Out, which won praise from critics. But here's the thing, as great as these movies I mentioned are, they aren't really horror movies. They fall more into the category of psychological thrillers. There are no spooky ghosts or monsters in these films. Instead, they deal with the intricacies of the human mind. These movies are exceptional and they have scary and tense moments, but they follow natural phenomena, which is why they are more palatable by critics. There are some true horror movies, and by some, I mean a very rare select few, that can get their hands on awards. The Exorcist, Alien, and Poltergeist come to mind. But besides the critics, I would wager to say that a great chunk of horror movies get underappreciated by general audiences too. We are quick to praise movies that can make the most of their settings and budgets, but when horror movies do this, we don't seem to give them that same praise. There are so many horror movies I can think of that put every dollar to use, and I would argue there really is no other genre where we see the same level of resourcefulness. Horror movies also have a greater tendency to confine themselves to one location, but they make the absolute most out of their settings. Horror movies also offer a deep insight into the mind. There is no genre that is as psychologically analytical as the horror movie. If you like Freud and Jung and psychologically analyzing things, then you have probably found that no other movie sticks to these phenomena as well as the horror movie. We never see the fight or flight instinct as deeply examined in any other genre, and this is the bread and butter of the horror movie. Horror movies also show us a great display of human relationships, and they give unique situations that offer insight in a way that no other genre can. For example, movies like The Thing, The Witch, and The Lighthouse show what isolation and distrust can do to people. Movies like Signs and The Mothman Prophecies show how faith is often the only antidote to fear. Saw offers us a crooked look at morality. The Ring, Halloween, Barbarian, and so many other films show us how evil truly does exist. But in addition to these lessons, let's think about the most common critique against movies today: the lack of originality. Everyone says that modern movies can't come up with new ideas and they never show us anything original. But this critique cannot be made against the horror movie. Some of the most unique concepts you'll ever see are only found in horror. Hellraiser is a great example, as it takes Jeremy Bentham's idea of the two masters of mankind being pain and pleasure, and it shows a physical manifestation of these contrasting extremes. Hellraiser, I hardly know The Cabin in the Woods, in addition to being hilarious, embodies how tradition and the system can be rigged against us from the start. The Call, a Korean horror movie that deals with a serial killer being able to talk to a girl from 20 years in the future through a magical telephone, is one of the most unique movies I've seen in recent years, and I highly recommend watching it if you haven't already. I believe it's on Netflix. I won't spoil it, but the idea is so damn unique, and for the most part, it's well executed. I already mentioned Signs, but the juxtaposition of faith and the extraterrestrial is just so unique, and we have to give the film praise for showing us ideas that we hadn't seen before. Let's also not forget the amazing monsters, locations, and set pieces in horror, and no other genre really comes close. The overall production design in horror is just some of the best you'll ever see. So if the horror movie has unique settings, ideas, and can show genuine insight into the mind, then why is it so underappreciated? Well, I would break this down into two areas: why the critics don't respect horror, and why general audiences don't respect horror. So dealing with critics first, I mentioned this before, but horror dealing with superstitions and the paranormal lends itself to being taken less seriously since it's already pushing the envelope of what's believable. On top of this, the horror genre is arguably the most formulaic genre there is. There is no other genre I can think of that is as riddled with tropes as the horror movie. It feels like in most horror movies, you have to have bad omens, incredibly sexually charged scenarios, stupid decisions, criminally unaware characters, a virgin heroine, and the monster must survive somehow at the end, because if it doesn't, then the movie isn't scary for some reason. The horror tropes are so common and well known that some of the best horror movies are those that make fun of the horror stereotypes and are self-aware about the genre's conventions. This formulaic nature of the horror movie is clearly a part of the stigma that is held by critics against the genre. I would also add that because so few horror movies come and break the mold, there is less innovation as movies stick to tradition, and this lack of progression isn't going to sit well with critics. But why do general audiences not appreciate horror that much? Well, I would say most people are too caught up in being scared to analyze the art that is unfolding before them. I've said this before in my other videos, but you really need to watch a movie twice at the absolute minimum before you can judge it, since the first watch is for experiencing, whereas the second watch is for understanding. Most people don't do this though, and with horror movies that are meant to put you on the edge of your seat and make you uncomfortable, this sets them up with even more unfavorable odds, as people won't go back to break down the craftsmanship of these films. A great example of this is The Exorcist, which you really need to watch twice to understand the symbolism and the play of ideas happening behind the initial layer of the spooky stuff that's scaring the shit out of us. I would throw so many other movies into this category that are criminally underappreciated since people don't go back to analyze what lies beneath the surface in these movies. I would argue this isn't as much of a problem in other films, since you aren't as uneasy and caught up with what's lying in front of you. It's easier to digest and observe the ideas in a drama or adventure movie, since your senses are not immediately heightened by what's going on in front of you when compared to the horror movie. In other words, you aren't as distracted with what's in the center of the shot, so you pay more attention to the craftsmanship. This is why I believe it's easier to appreciate a drama or adventure movie at a first glance rather than a horror movie, since they are easier to digest. Horror also has some of the most unique directing you'll ever see. Drama and comedies can get away with the director basically being invisible and not doing that much and letting the movies speak for themselves. But horror requires the director to be more hands-on, and this is a great way to see some more creative styles in film. But despite my love for the horror movie and my vouching of it, I must admit something. Good horror movies are rare. During this video, I have talked about the exceptional few, and I still do believe they are not given the full respect they deserve. But these films are the needles in the haystack. Bad horror movies are a dime a dozen, and there are so many underwhelming horror movies that I wouldn't know where to start. You have so many cheap slashers, and the amount of blatant copies in the horror genre has put detective movies to shame. But despite the rarity of exceptional horror movies, I believe we can still agree that the genre is the least respected in the medium we call film. So let's give horror its respect, because it doesn't seem like the Academy is going to anytime soon.